Ever gone down one of those internet rabbit holes? Start with something simple, like,
Mm.
what are human rights? And then hours later, you come up for air and you're like, whoa! The sheer scale of it all, it's mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. Happens to the best of us, I think. That why it's so fascinating, though, right? It seems like such a simple question at first, but the answer, it's anything but simple.
And that is exactly why we are tackling it head-on in today's deep dive. We're going behind the scenes of the Wikipedia article on human rights. And trust me, it's way more interesting than your average encyclopedia entry.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about tracing the evolution of an idea, like this foundational idea that underpins so much of modern society. But at the same time, it's still constantly evolving. It's fascinating.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. When we throw around the phrase human rights, what do we really even mean? Like, what actually makes something a right?
Well, you've hit on a debate. That has kept philosophers busy for centuries. The article defines human rights as moral principles or norms that establish standards of human behavior. But then getting everyone to agree on exactly what those should be, that's a whole other story.
And just to make it even more complex, these aren't just guidelines, right? They're supposed to be universal, so they apply to everyone equally.
Exactly. Regardless of where you're born, what you believe, what you do, the idea is that these rights are inherent to your very existence, not privileges granted by any authority.
Okay, see, now this is where I always get tripped up. If it's inherent, does that mean we were born with, like, a list of rights taped to our foreheads or something? When did this whole concept even start?
It's easy to assume human rights have always been around, but that's a myth. While ancient civilizations had their own systems of justice and fairness, the modern conception of universal human rights, the kind enshrined in the UDHR, that's surprisingly recent.
Wait, hold on. Before we fast forward to the UDHR, tell me more about these ancient systems. Did anyone even come close to the idea of universal rights back then?
It's less about full-blown systems and more about, like, these glimmers of the ideas that we recognize today. Take the concept of natural rights that emerged in the 17th century. Thinkers like John Locke argue that humans are born with inherent rights to life, liberty, and property simply because they are human.
So not a literal list taped to our foreheads, but already a radical idea for its time.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate either. Locke's ideas had a massive impact, influencing revolutions in both America and France.
Oh, wow. Talk about influence. Those revolutions were all about securing those very rights, freedom from tyranny, the right to self-determination, echoes of Locke everywhere.
Precisely. Those historical moments show that the seeds of human rights were planted long before the 20th century, even if they hadn't fully blossomed yet. But it took some truly horrific events in the 20th century for the world to collectively wake up and say, enough is enough. We need to codify these rights on a global scale.
And I think we all know what those horrific events were. Horrors of World War II, especially the Holocaust. It's almost impossible to grasp the sheer scale of suffering.
It was a turning point in human history. The atrocities committed during that time, they shook the world's conscience to its core and made it abundantly clear that something had to change. It really was a turning point. And the thing about the UDHR, the really remarkable thing, I think, is that it wasn't just diplomats, sitting around signing off on these abstract principles. It was the culmination of this huge global movement with people from all walks of life coming together and saying, we demand a better future.
I can only imagine the atmosphere at the UN when it was finally adopted. Did they realize they were making history? Like, did they have that sense of, whoa?
The article mentions Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yep.
And she played a pivotal role in drafting the UDHR. She called it a potential international Magna Carta. So I think that gives you a sense of the weight of the moment.
Wow, Eleanor Roosevelt. She's such a fascinating figure. What was it about her that made her such a powerful advocate for human rights, especially on that global stage?
I think it was this incredible combination of her deep compassion and understanding of social justice, but also her political acumen. She knew how to navigate those really complex waters of international diplomacy, and she knew how to push for meaningful change. And because of her tireless work, the UDHR really had the power to shift the paradigm.
So how did it do that? What made it so groundbreaking?
Well, for the first time in history, nations actually came together to legally limit state behavior on this massive scale. It was this bold statement that challenged that traditional notion of absolute state sovereignty.
So it's like saying even governments aren't above the law when it comes to how they treat their own citizens. That's huge. But it wasn't just a symbolic gesture, right? Did the UDHR actually lead to concrete changes?
It absolutely did. It laid the groundwork for a whole framework of international human rights law. It inspired the creation of numerous treaties, like the two major covenants we touched on earlier, the ICCPR and the ICSCR.
Right. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Those felt pretty important, but I'll admit I always get a little lost in the acronyms. Can you remind me what those are all about?
Think of it like this. The UDHR sets the broad principles, and then these covenants, they get into the nitty-gritty details. So the ICCPR focuses on protecting civil and political rights, things like freedom of speech, religion, the right to a fair trial, the kind of rights that protect individuals from government overreach.
Okay, so those feel very fundamental to like a free and just society.
Yeah.
What about the other one, the ICSCR?
The ICSCR addresses economic, social, and cultural rights. So things like the right to work, education, healthcare, things that allow people to thrive and reach their full potential. And this is where things got a bit tricky during the Cold War.
Right. The article mentioned something about the Cold War creating this tension around different types of rights. How did that play out?
Basically, the Cold War created this divide where you had Western nations often prioritizing civil and political rights, while socialist states emphasized economic and social rights. It was almost like two sides of the same coin were being pitted against each other, rather than being seen as complementary aspects of human dignity.
It's a shame that such a crucial concept got caught up in those geopolitical struggles.
It is. It's a reminder that progress is rarely linear. But I think the beauty of the UDHR is that it encompasses this beautiful tapestry of rights. You have the civil, the political, the economic, the social, the cultural. They're all interconnected, and they're all equally important.
So it's not an either-or situation. You need all of those rights to create a truly just and equitable society.
Exactly. And beyond these two covenants, a whole network of treaties emerged, tackling issues like genocide, torture, children's rights, discrimination, each one building on that foundation laid by the UDHR. It really shows how the conversation around human rights has expanded over time.
It makes you realize that achieving these rights, it isn't just about these lofty declarations. It requires constant effort and action. So how do we actually make these rights real in the world? How do we bridge that gap between aspiration and reality?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a complex web of efforts. On a global level, you have international organizations like the UN. They're monitoring human rights situations. They're creating legal frameworks, investigating abuses, holding perpetrators accountable.
But it's not just about the UN, right? The article mentioned regional groups like the African Union and the Council of Europe. What role do they play?
They're absolutely crucial. These regional organizations, they provide a more localized approach to human rights because they understand the specific challenges and cultural contexts of their regions, and they can often respond more effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. So you have global efforts and regional efforts, but ultimately, doesn't it come down to individual nations upholding these rights within their own borders?
Absolutely. What international pressure and cooperation are essential, real change happens on the ground. It's about each nation incorporating human rights principles into their own laws, their policies, their practices.
But I'm guessing it's not always smooth sailing.
Uh,
What are some of the biggest challenges to making human rights a reality for everyone?
You're right. It's far from perfect. There are these ongoing debates and tensions around human rights. One major challenge is this tension between universalism, the idea that these rights apply to everyone, and cultural relativism, which emphasizes cultural differences and argues that some rights might not be universally applicable.
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I've heard that debate a lot, especially regarding certain cultural practices. The article brings up the rather sensitive example of female genital mutilation, or FGM, and how it's viewed so differently across cultures. That feels like a pretty charged example of this tension.
It is. It's a prime example of how complex these issues can get, because FGM is often seen as a violation of women's rights by the international community. But some cultures view it as a cultural or religious tradition. And this is where the conversation around cultural relativism comes into play.
It raises the question then, whose interpretation should prevail when cultural practices clash with those universal human rights standards? It's a tough one for sure.
It is. And it leads to another major challenge. This tension between universal jurisdiction, the idea that some crimes are so horrific that they can be prosecuted anywhere, and state sovereignty, which is a country's right to govern itself without interference.
So we're talking about a real clash of principles here, holding individuals accountable for these egregious crimes versus respecting a nation's right to handle its own affairs. How does that tension actually play out in the real world?
Well, the article highlights a really captivating case, the arrest of Augusto Pinochet. Back in 1998, he was arrested in London on a Spanish warrant, sent shockwaves through the international community.
Pete Pinochet, remind me, he was the dictator of Chile. Right, what were the charges?
Exactly. Pinochet was accused of numerous human rights abuses during his rule, We're talking torture, extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, a whole range of horrific crimes.
So even though these alleged crimes happened in Chile, a Spanish judge claimed jurisdiction. That feels like a bold move.
It was unprecedented. The Spanish judge argued that the crimes Pinochet was accused of, they were so heinous, so universally condemned, that they transcended national borders.
Yeah.
He was invoking the principle of universal jurisdiction, the idea that certain crimes are so grave that any state can prosecute them, regardless of where they actually occurred.
Wow, so it's like saying some offenses are so horrific. They're considered crimes against humanity itself. And what happened to Pinochet? Was he actually extradited to Spain?
It became a huge legal battle, dragged on for years. Ultimately, Pinochet was never extradited to Spain due to his declining health. But the case set a major precedent. It put powerful leaders on notice that they could potentially be held accountable for human rights violations, even after leaving office.
That must have sent chills down the spines of dictators and authoritarian leaders around the world. It's a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice doesn't stop at borders.
Exactly. It highlights the global nature of human rights.
Yeah.
But the Pinochet case also underscores just how messy and complex these issues can be. There are no easy answers. And it's not just states grappling with these challenges. Increasingly, the role of multinational corporations is coming under scrutiny.
That's right. The article talks about how these companies, they can wield immense power, sometimes even more than some governments. What happens when a multinational corporation operating across borders is accused of human rights abuses? Who holds them accountable?
That is the billion-dollar question, and one that keeps human rights advocates up at night. Because right now, there's a significant gap in international law. When it comes to corporate accountability, there are codes of conduct and voluntary guidelines, but no legally binding international treaty specifically addresses corporate behavior and human rights.
So there's no real international legal framework to hold these companies accountable for things like labor exploitation, environmental damage, or complicity in human rights abuses in their supply chains.
Not in a comprehensive, enforceable way. There are national laws, of course, and some countries have started implementing stricter regulations. But the lack of a global treaty creates this patchwork of laws and loopholes that companies can exploit.
The article mentions a quote from Gene Ziegler that really stuck with me. He was a UN special rapporteur, and he said, "It's now time to develop binding legal norms that hold corporations to human rights standards." That feels incredibly relevant, especially with the growing power and influence of multinational companies.
It's a call to action. That's resonating with more and more people. The question is, will it translate into concrete action on a global scale? That's something worth keeping an eye on.
It makes you realize this is far from a settled issue. The fight for human rights. It's constantly evolving, with new challenges emerging all the time. So as we kind of wade through this complex landscape, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they encounter these issues in the news and in their own lives?
I think the most important takeaway is that human rights, they're not just some abstract concept confined to dusty law books. They're about the fundamental dignity and freedom of every person on this planet, understanding these rights and the ongoing struggles to secure them. It's essential for engaged citizenship in the 21st century.
It's not a spectator sport. Whether we realize it or not, we're all part of this story, this ongoing journey towards a more just and equitable world.
And it's a journey that demands constant vigilance and action from all of us. We need to be aware of the challenges, support organizations working to protect human rights, and hold those in power accountable, whether it's governments or corporations.
It's about raising our voices, demanding justice, and never losing sight of the inherent dignity of every human being. And it strikes me that as technology advances, as global challenges become more interconnected, this conversation about human rights is only going to become more complex and more crucial.
Absolutely. The digital age, globalization, climate change, all of these forces are reshaping the landscape of human rights, creating both new opportunities and new threats. One area that I find particularly fascinating right now, and that I think deserves a lot more attention, is the growing recognition of environmental rights.
Oh yes, we touched on that earlier. The UN recognizing a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. As a human right, how do you see that playing out in the future?
It has the potential to be a game changer because it connects the dots between environmental protection and social justice in really powerful ways. But it also raises a whole host of questions. How do we define and enforce these rights? How do we balance competing interests and priorities? These are questions we'll need to grapple with collectively as we navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
What a fascinating thought to leave us with. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this vast and vitally important topic. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into human rights. And to our listeners, keep asking questions, stay informed, and never stop fighting for a better world.